U.S. federal government employs roughly 2.4 million people across over 400 agencies.
That's actually a good amount of employees. I knew that they were one of the largest employers, but this is actually a pretty surprising number for me. Maybe I just haven't been paying attention enough in the past.
That's not including postal workers and active duty military personnel. President Trump has said he wants to decrease the size of that workforce by up to 10%, or 240,000 people.
So one of the interesting things is I feel like if you look at the history of America overall, I feel like some of the best moves that people think about over time is the government actually creating job opportunities for individuals here in America. And so obviously them being a direct employer is one of the ways that they can do that.
The effort to downsize the government has been led by Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency. Tens of thousands of federal employees were laid off in recent weeks.
We were leaving work fully employed and coming back the next morning without a job.
But now the terminations are being challenged in court, and the administration has been ordered to issue sweeping job reinstatements.
Two federal courts on opposite coasts taking similar cases and coming to similar decisions here, ruling that the firings of so-called probationary workers were improper mass firings and ordering that tens of thousands of these workers be put back on their jobs.
It's unclear when reinstated employees will be asked to return to work, as some are reportedly being put on administrative leave.
Yeah, this is one of the challenges with that, which is if you know they're coming around firing people, you probably don't want to be the person who signed off on these people coming back to the office when who knows if you're going to be the next person added to the list for doing that. And so that just doesn't seem like a psychologically safe environment for you to be going out of your way to rehire people that you know somebody already wants fired. And I think that's true at any workplace, not just the federal government right now. I think if you're trying to step out to kind of offset an opinion of somebody else, you have to be very secure in your own job to be able to do that, because then it can just draw attention to you and you need to be prepared for it.
Trump administration has also moved to dismantle entire agencies, such as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the Department of Education.
Save the civil service!
But again, courts around the country are challenging the legality of those cuts.
This has been an extraordinary first part of the second Trump term. What's been most extraordinary is the way in which the new administration has fundamentally destroyed so much of the capability in our government.
At the center of it all, a narrative that the federal government is too large.
We're cutting down government. We're cutting down the size of government. We have to. We're bloated. We're sloppy. We have a lot.
So this is an interesting sentiment overall. If I'm recalling correctly, obviously this is a Republican standpoint overall. I feel like this is a message that they have shared. If I'm not mistaken, I think Reagan might have been one of the individuals who advocated for this sentiment. And I don't believe it was as prevalent before then. If any of you know better, feel free to correct me. But I think this was part of his campaign slogan. And I'm pretty sure he's also the individual who basically coined the original phrase of like, make America great again. And I think this all came from the sentiment of the government is bad, or like America is bad. And I think he was the one who sort of is at least the face in my mind of this change. Obviously, for a lot of younger folks or newer folks to US politics, they probably see Trump as this individual. I'm not sure if there was an individual before Reagan who started to push for these ideas. I believe that most presidents before then were generally seen as good, and the government actions and ways that they interacted with the people were generally seen as good, in so much as like they were effectively trying to fight for people. Maybe they weren't necessarily as inclusive of who those people were considered at that time, but I think generally speaking, more government regulation, more government workers, I think was seen as a good thing. And so it's interesting that this has sort of become like the token slogan for Republicans, and that there's sort of this anti-government segment of the political party, which is interesting to me considering that they also generally stand for obviously conservative views, and they generally kind of liken it back to older scenarios that existed and kind of want to stay put in some of those worldviews and how things functioned, that the government somehow didn't make itself part of that vision.
A lot of people that aren't doing their job.
Efforts to streamline the government workforce and cut down on spending are not new.
I am ordering a reduction of the federal bureaucracy by at least 100,000 positions over the next 4 years. The steps we're taking today will save the American taxpayers $9 billion.
There's no doubt that there's bloat in some places, in some functions. But you got to identify it first. You don't just cut the whole thing. What they're going to have to.
So that's an interesting perspective. I do generally agree with what that individual is saying, which is there's bound to be bloat. I think if you're at a company or any business or employment where they aren't regularly laying folks off, then likely bloat is going to be natural, especially because you're going to likely get used to things, and also people can kind of linger around, and I think quiet quitting is a real thing that exists. Not saying that everybody does this, but I do think that having individuals like that in a workforce can negatively impact the rest of the workers. Because if you're seeing one employee who's kind of doing the bare minimum, or maybe even less than that, why would you go above and beyond maybe for 1 or 2% higher pay than what that individual has? Why would you put in 3, 4, 5 times or more work for barely any reward in that scenario? I think that's generally a negative cycle that can occur in these scenarios. And certainly layoffs to federal workers aren't that common, that likely every so often there is bloat. But I do agree with what she mentioned. Generally, the most precise way to do this is to investigate and then figure out where it is. But I think that there is the general phrase from like Silicon Valley and startups of move quickly and fail fast. And I think that's exactly what Elon Musk is doing right now, which is fire people first, figure out whether it was right or not later, because you can undo it. And so I think this is where, in these scenarios, you can get to answers much more quickly. Imagine if Elon had asked everybody to sort of come up with a list, figure out who is bloat and who isn't bloat. You don't really know who these people are. What if the person you ask to generate the report is the person who is the bloat, and they need to justify their job and their department? And so it's a really hard thing to do, especially as like an outsider to that organization. And it likely would have taken a lot of time in order to try to figure out what it was, and likely still wouldn't have gotten it right at that point. And so I'm not necessarily agreeing with what he did, but I do think that there are different perspectives on how you can go about this. And I think just stating one is correct and one is incorrect is likely untrue. There's a lot of gray area in a lot of life and a lot of situations. And so I think sometimes you can overdo it by pushing too far into one side versus another. And so I just want to highlight that there is valid scenarios and trade-offs that you can have. I think the one side is you can make mistakes, but then you can learn things very quickly. And the other side is maybe you make less mistakes, but it could take a longer time.
To do is they're cutting the whole thing, and they're going to have to go back and build again, right? The things that they cut out that in fact turn out to be essential.
So just how wasteful has the US federal government become? And has it gotten worse over time? And will cutting government workers and programs actually make a dent in the nation's more than $1.8 trillion deficit?
So something that was interesting is that they highlighted the deficit as one of the things that they're trying to offset here. I'm not entirely sure if that is going to be the case. I don't think the deficit is primarily generated through employees. I think usually this is done obviously by debt purposes. And so, especially to get to the number that they're currently at, there's likely a lot of loans that are involved. And I think that the government's stance on a financial basis is that debt can be good in certain scenarios. And so I don't know if those two things are correlated enough for them to materially impact the other one. I would suspect that if the government had a zero deficit, that they would probably actually be asking themselves, why don't we take on more loans so that way we can grow faster and like we can do more things. And so I'm not sure if we're ever truly going to have like a zero deficit. I think it's more so what is the right number and how do you kind of stay within those bounds. I doubt the employee salaries at the government, who I don't think make that much money, generally speaking, compared to other professions in the public sector make, that is the primary driver of the deficit. But we'll see what they have to share on this.
The first few months of the second Trump administration have been a roller coaster for federal employees impacted by mass layoffs.
I was one of the thousands of federal workers terminated this weekend.
I have gone through the entire range of emotions this past weekend. There is a lot of sadness in my heart. There is also a lot of anger.
Roughly 24,000 workers received notices that their jobs were being terminated. Now, at least...
Not related to what they're currently saying, but that last person on presumably TikTok or whatever that was, they're actually very calm about how they were describing sadness and anger. They maybe are enlightened, I guess. I think that was very impressive how they were able to describe generally intense emotions with such a calm demeanor. So maybe it was scripted, or maybe they're a very enlightened individual. I hope it's the second, and I hope that they are somebody who is enlightened and just knows how to speak to their emotions in a constructive fashion, and maybe they can teach the rest of us on how to do that as well.
One court has ordered that the Trump administration rehire those employees. Beneath the chaos, a renewed debate around the size of government has emerged, which Trump claims is too large. But what do the numbers say? Here's a look at the federal workforce. The US government is the country's largest employer, with more workers on its payroll than Amazon or Walmart. Around 2.4 million people are on the federal payroll. That number doesn't include more than 600,000 US postal workers, government contractors.
It actually wasn't that much larger than Amazon or Walmart, I think, were their examples here. And so even combined, if you add in the post office workers, that'd be 3 million. Amazon plus Walmart would be larger than the federal government. So that was a big number, but not huge in the grand scheme of things.
Around 2.4 million people are on the federal payroll. That number doesn't include more than 600,000 US postal workers, government contractors, or active duty military personnel. More than 80% of those employees live outside the DC area, in places like California, Texas, and Florida. The Department of Veterans Affairs was the largest employer in 2024, followed by the Department of Homeland Security, the Army, and the Navy.
A lot of people just think of like white collar bureaucrats making all these decisions that they don't care about or that don't affect them. That's far from the truth. These are nurses, these are park rangers.
The single largest occupation of federal workers is healthcare.
There's actually a lot of females calling out that they were let go. I'm not sure if there's actually a trend. I don't want to insinuate there's anything going on there, but it's surprising. Maybe they're just much more vocal on social media or in general. But curious how I think the 3 individuals they've highlighted so far who were impacted were all female.
Related. And the most common occupation is nursing. The second most common occupation was administrative.
Wow, nursing is not what I would have guessed off the top of my head, but administrative I would have said for sure. If you asked me top 2, administrative definitely would have made it. Nursing, I don't even know if I would have guessed top 10, honestly. It's very curious that this is part of it. They did mention the Veterans Affairs being a sizable portion of it, so maybe these are nurses to help support veterans, etc. So logically, I could see it, but I certainly wouldn't have guessed it.
When we talk about the civil service, we're talking about the 2 million or so career professionals who do everything from inspect the meat that you buy in the supermarkets so it's not going to get your kids sick, or those air traffic.
So this feels slightly like a straw man argument here. I think, again, I do suspect that there is bloat, but DOGE hasn't gone after air traffic control, or I don't think they have gone after the folks who inspect our meat and food. And so I think everyone would agree that those people are very essential. I think some of the companies and some of the groups of people that Elon has fired, I barely knew existed or what they actually do. Not saying that I am an expert on what the government does or whether that should be the qualification for whether an entity should exist. But I do think the obvious ones are likely going to get the least amount of scrutiny here. It's likely the ones that are sort of out of sight, out of mind, that are likely going to be the most impacted, because if their benefits aren't very noticeably seen, like making sure you don't crash when you're on an airplane or that your food is safe to eat, that you probably are reminded of on a regular basis, that you're going to have something to justify that cost. And I think, obviously, he's taken action pretty quickly, but as far as I can tell, he's mostly gone after organizations that are less noticeable to the average American, in my opinion.
Traffic controllers who are responsible for making sure our air system is safe, or the intelligence analyst who is trying to stop incursions by China or Russia into our digital.
Yeah, I highly doubt Elon Musk was like, all these counter hacker/terrorist groups, completely useless. We're just wasting a bunch of money here. Again, I feel like we just picked some of the obvious beneficial segments of the federal government and used that as an example. I feel like I would be much more convinced if they had said something about like US aid, for instance. Like, I'd love to understand more about what they really do. Obviously, like, Elon Musk himself has described what they have done, but I would like to think that you should take that with a grain of salt. He's trying to show that he made the correct decision by saying they basically don't do anything of value or even potentially detrimental things. And so having arguments for why those organizations that he did noticeably impact were actually beneficial, I would have loved to see. Hopefully they're going to cover those, but already reiterating things that are pretty obvious, in my opinion, that are beneficial as examples of why federal governments need employees at all, I don't think was a worthwhile portion of time. I assume everybody knows you can't just have a zero employee federal government. Clearly there have to be some people doing some things. I think the lack of understanding for myself and probably most Americans or folks looking in is, who are those people and like what do they actually do and which ones are the most critical? And I don't think I have answers to that, but hopefully somebody does.
Infrastructure, I mean, the list is long and it affects everybody in all kinds of different ways.
President Trump has cited multiple reasons for the cuts. The first, federal budget savings.
Tremendous saving for us. We want to downsize government, but make it better.
The president has argued that layoffs will help balance the federal budget and place more responsibility on state governments.
For a lot of Americans, they did feel like our government was too big, it's too bloated. They want to see cuts.
I do think that there is tremendous.
Agreed. I think what that last individual said, which is, if people didn't agree with that sentiment, they wouldn't have voted for Trump. And I think that's something that might be unsettling for some folks, but personally, I suspect more people, eyes wide open, voted for Trump, hoping he was going to take particular actions. And I think those people are excited about some of these changes that are happening, even though not everyone would agree with those changes, but that's how democracy works. It is not unanimous decisions, it is majority decisions. And so inherently that means somebody is going to be unhappy about those. And that's not what any government is trying to do, certainly not democratic ones. And so I do think some portion of this is what was anticipated and actually specifically desired by presumably a pretty sizable portion of America, if that's what actually occurred.
Tremendous upside to reducing the size of the federal government, given the massive expansion that has happened. And just starting from a 10,000 foot level, what goes to the federal government does not go to individuals and businesses.
There's no question the US is facing a budget crisis. In 2024, the US spent $1.83 trillion more than it took in, a deficit that has been steadily growing for years. But how do federal workers fit into the budget? The average federal worker earns a little over $100,000 per year. In the fiscal 2024 year, the government spent $835 billion in personnel compensation and benefits. That number makes up only 8.6% of the government's total.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. As I mentioned earlier, I would have assumed there's so many other things that they spend money on that employees would not have made the top of the list for me in my mind of why the government is at that deficit. I'm not sure if that was the actual argument that Trump made or Elon made. I don't watch every statement that they have or keep 100% up to date, but certainly that would be a foolish thing to say in my mind, that those things are clearly not related. Certainly grants, other things make a lot more sense. There's a lot of things that they have to do that they support, including things that we already know about, I'm sure, are incorporated in this, like tax refunds, for instance, or tax credits, all get set up from here and not necessarily just people's salaries. And they can even have here towards the right of contract workers and suppliers and things like that at 11.8%. That makes sense to me. I would have assumed that they spend more money on contracts than people, just considering the size of projects that they do and the number of people that they work with. So I don't know if I would have guessed 8.6, but I definitely would have certainly knew people at the federal government and federal employees were certainly not the largest chunk of that pie.
Total spending. And that's less than the amount of interest paid on the government's debt, which was $1.1 trillion last year.
The reality is that this is going to cost the American taxpayer more money than it will ever save. It is not that large of a proportion of our federal government's expense. It's quite small against the larger program requirements that we have in our government.
But data shows that the federal workforce has actually remained about the same size for the past 50 years, even as federal spending has quintupled.
That is a great stat. I feel like they should start with some of these stats. I feel like sometimes they bury the lead and then sometimes they sort of undo their argument towards the end of the segments. The government being basically the same size seems to be like the strongest argument for the fact that there isn't bloat over the last 50 years, because then they would have to argue that it was bloated when Trump was previously president and he just let it be. And so I think there's a lot more arguments that could have been built off of this case. We are halfway, so maybe they'll keep extending on it, but that seems like a pretty reasonably justifiable example. Obviously, I would expect in 50 years with computers and technology, etc., that some of these workers are getting more efficient, but also populations are getting more efficient. Populations are growing. There's more things for these people to do, but for the size of the federal employee base to be the same, seems to be a pretty open and shut case.
Studies show that the gap can be explained by an increase in the number of federal contractors. One report estimates that federal contractors currently outnumber federal employees by more than 2 to 1, although the exact number of federal contractors is not known.
The actual headcount of our federal government is about the same size as it was in 1969. What's different is that we have a whole bunch more contractors and grantees. If you were really trying to control for costs, you would be focusing way much more there than you would be on the...
I 100% agree with this point, which is, if you really were focused on cost, just start firing all those contractors. Like, that seems like something that you could probably get away with as long as the contracts allowed for some type of separation early, where you're going to be much more in control of your employees and whether they're spending their time wisely or not. If they're actually like in-home employees within the federal government, where there's policies, there's regulation, there's management, there's oversight, instead of contractors where like maybe you hand out some cash and then you don't really know what happens with it or how they're spending it. That to me seems like a phenomenal way of cutting back on expenses over employees. But again, I don't think they've proven that there isn't bloat, but I think this is a great argument that they're making of this probably should have been a higher priority. And I gotta be honest, I don't know if it is. Elon mostly talks about the employees that are getting fired, and also people talk a lot about those employees. I'm less clear on the state of contractors.
Direct headcount of federal employees, and you'd actually be trying to reduce federal employees strategically, which is not what is happening now.
The Trump administration has started to examine government contracts, although some of those efforts have stalled. Some experts say the firings are a roundabout way of cutting back on both contracts and entitlement programs.
There's room for savings coming from a smaller size of the federal workforce.
Yeah, more likely, potentially a debatable topic, but I would assume most of the things that are getting let go are things that Elon and presumably Trump disagree with. And so that's likely why they're getting the most scrutiny, which is Trump has already mentioned trade deficits. And so clearly he cares about how much US dollars are going to other countries. So US aid seems like a great next step if that's your line of thinking, which is I want less American dollars going out. I want more money coming in. And so if you have an organization that's entirely built around taking money from the federal government or US money and pumping it outwards, then clearly that would be on the chopping block in my mind. And so I presume that's really the segment here, which is he probably can't go around demolishing entire swaths of the government that he disagrees with, but he can probably cripple them to the point where like they're not as effective and he doesn't need to worry about them doing things that he disagrees with. I assume that's the entire point, but maybe that's controversial, maybe not. Maybe you can share your thoughts in the comments below.
But that's not the bulk of the savings. It's more the spending that's going out the door from all of these programs. There are federal workers that are administering these programs and that are issuing those payments, but you have to actually reduce the size of those programs of payments to get those big savings.
Elaine Kamarck worked in the Clinton administration and managed the National Performance Review. The program reduced the federal workforce by 426,000 employees and created the smallest federal government since Eisenhower's presidency.
I think it's a good thing that they're looking at all the contracts the government lets, and certainly there are some contracts that probably shouldn't have been let that are sort of silly. On the other hand, they're all mixed in, right? You gotta do this with a scalpel, not an axe. Every year, the U.S. government, through USAID, buys $2.1 billion worth of wheat, soybeans, and rice from American farmers and sends this to starving people overseas in famine countries. That, I think, is a lot of Americans would think is a pretty good use of taxpayer dollar.
Under Clinton's reform programs, the administration worked with Congress to make strategic cutbacks and eliminate regulations. In testimony, Kamarck said that the program ultimately saved the government around $136 billion.
I'm a big believer in reviews of federal government functioning. There are regulations that have to be thrown out. There's functions that become, sort of yesterday's work. So I think it's a good thing to do, but they're doing that in a way that they're taking down entire organizations which have statutory authority. I think the difference.
So something that I'm finding interesting here, I don't know if it's intentional or not, potentially, since they had time to create this video and reference it, is that Bill Clinton, I believe, is from the Democratic Party. And so they are highlighting potentially a cut that exists that they do agree with, which maybe helps the case of maybe some cuts do make sense at certain points. They did reference the 1969 numbers, which certainly wasn't Clinton's time. And so one of the interesting things that I think they could have had an argument here for was, why was that office and number of employees acceptable at that time, but now we need to grow again to kind of replace any employees that were let go back to higher numbers? I think, again, this is where data can be interesting and how it shows certain things, where if you looked at the numbers from like the 90s to now and the last like 30, 40 years, you probably have seen employees went down and then presumably they went back up by a noticeable amount. But they chose to compare today's numbers to the 60s numbers to show that they're basically stagnant. And that's an interesting choice that you're making, because you as the observer of the data get to make that selection, and you get to choose the window And so they chose a window that showed that they were equivalent. And so some of this information is starting to be somewhat conflicting. I thought that was one of their stronger arguments. And again, they seem to sort of be letting up a little bit with that data and some other conflicting stories that they have going on.
Here, the critical difference is we weren't looking just to cut. We titled our report, Works Better, Costs Less. And the works better was as important as the cost less.
A second rationale for the cuts is smaller government is better. Some argue that the cutbacks are aimed at moving the workforce into the private sector or state and local governments.
A smaller government footprint, smaller government sector just brings labor and capital resources to the private sector, and that is a disinflationary story.
A lot of the things that the federal government is doing now would be far better served by state and local governments or even private charities and businesses themselves, because when you have this approach of like the top down, is often you don't get the results that you want because policymakers in DC don't know how these programs are working and how best to serve people on the ground.
But does a smaller federal workforce actually move resources to the private sector? Nearly half of voters surveyed in 2024 believe that the government is doing things that are better left to the private sector. However, experts predict there may be downsides to this migration.
You'd absolutely see that. There's people who are highly skilled, a lot of PhDs, a lot of lawyers, et cetera, with huge expertise. They're going to go into the private sector. That's going to be competition in local economies all over the country. It's also going to hurt local economies.
I think that there is a desire to shrink the size of the government. That's natural when people feel like they're not receiving the services that they're paying for with their taxes. But to just kind of eliminate programs at random and eliminate employees at random does not achieve that goal.
While the legality of the firings plays out in courts across the country, there's concern that if Trump's efforts to downsize the federal workforce are...
So that individual that just spoke not too long ago, he was actually from the USDA. And again, here would have been a great scenario where even that last lady before him had mentioned how there was a lot of money going into the hands of farmers in America to send food to places with famine or hungry people. And so they sort of referenced things that are of value from some of these organizations, as I had sort of requested earlier as I was watching this, of I would have loved to see how some of these jobs specifically helped and like who was actually cut. Because it's not clear, like that individual who just came from the USDA, was he actually somebody who was inspecting meat? Was he some other person that was just sitting around? Like, did his job actually negatively impact American citizens when he lost it? It's unclear to me, and you're talking to these individuals. They were interviewed. It seemed like an easy case where that individual could have just described his job and what he did and how it brought value and how that's missing now. And it feels like they had all the pieces to make an argument out of that, but then didn't. And so I'm not sure if they didn't think it mattered or maybe that person's job wasn't as critical, but I feel like they could be making some stronger arguments here, and I feel like they have the pieces to do it, but they sort of assembled them in a different way than I probably would have myself.
Are successful, public services may be impacted.
In terms of the EPA, I think people are going to see notices that they'll have to boil their water. I think it's going to be detrimental to our environment.
Layoffs at the U.S. Forest Service, for example, have...
That individual, I think, slam dunk. That made a lot of sense. They could have just had more people saying that, like, oh, your water is probably not going to be clean anymore. Like, that's going to be a problem for you. Sold. We probably need that person back. I don't know why they just didn't do that with all the other people that they kind of referenced earlier. That would have been a very open and shut case in my mind. Instead, they sort of used conflicting arguments of like how the Democrats made cuts better, but then referenced a different time to describe it as not being bloated, even though it was higher than a somewhat recent cut. And so again, I feel like this argument's kind of getting convoluted, and I feel like they just did it right there. Hey, I'm in charge of this thing. I think people's water is going to become dirtier and potentially unsafe with me not working there. Perfect. That makes sense. That's not something I want to happen. That person should have a job. They should have just done that for the other people, in my mind.
Raise questions about what resources will be available to prevent wildfires in the wake of deadly fires in Los Angeles this year. Veterans are bracing for the potential impact mass terminations may have on the services provided to them by the VA. And new layoffs at the Department of Education could impact school and university access to federal funds. Thousands of newly unemployed, highly skilled workers could also have implications for the economy.
When you cut all that spending, the private sector that's the beneficiary of that, plus cutting 10% of the workforce in the federal government, which is out of 2.4 million jobs, 240,000 jobs, together that's 1 million jobs. And that takes you from 4.1% unemployment, we believe, to 4.5% unemployment. And so the pain of getting through that
how do you get through that, right? That is going to be painful. And it's going to be a potential hit on growth. How can it not be?
It will be a hit on growth.
I think there's a general lack of understanding of what federal workers do for the American public. I really worry about the future in which the federal civil service has been demonized and we don't have skilled workers in the federal civil service, and things start to happen like our parents and grandparents stop getting their Social Security checks, or veterans stop getting health care that they need, that food banks and food pantries don't have food in them.
Experts say the mass firings could end up costing more taxpayer dollars than saving money, as more cases will be brought forward alleging the firings were illegal.
You have an administration that has taken the position, sue me, I'll see you in court, rather than being very careful about using the public's authority in ways that are not going to either disrupt important accepted norms or create havoc in our society and legal system.
They've set up basically a constitutional crisis because everything they're trying to do, whether it's shut down USAID or the consumer agency, is a law that Congress passed. So they're headed straight for the Supreme Court and straight for a big fight.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.